There's a whole topic of land readjustment which we're not going to deal with today. When you come to tax-based instruments, you get development charges where the charge is not based on the cost of infrastructure, it's based on some other tax, some other way of taxing, maybe like the value of the property or something. It's divorced from the cost of infrastructure. Property tax is the most obvious one as a tax-based instrument. Betterment taxes, betterment levies, and we'll talk more about that as we go along, where you're charging people an amount because the infrastructure is improving. And then tax increment funding, where a group of properties get together and agree to provide more infrastructure, and that group of properties has a tax surplus applied to them to fund that infrastructure. So as you can see, there's quite a complex set of issues to be dealt with and instruments to be dealt with here. And hopefully by the end of today, we will have had a chance to discuss them a bit more. And at the end of the session, if people want a bit more information on one or the other, we can have a chat about that as well. Okay, now when this diagram, I'm going to talk you through it progressively, so you don't have to look at the whole thing at once. So again, along the top, we're talking about the evolution of cities. As cities evolve on those blue boxes, we go from undeveloped property, developed property with basic services, increased building height, greater density, and finally focusing on building performance, green space, recreation. So your property becomes more and more complex. The infrastructure which serves your property down below also becomes more complex. You start with basic infrastructure, you improve your infrastructure service levels, you start putting in mass transit, you start doing CBD upgrades, parks, etc. You moving towards quality of life infrastructure. Or at the very extreme, you may have infrastructure for very specific purposes, a particular area that wants particular infrastructure. So the green spheres are the menu of options we have. So you start with in-kind contributions to once-off payments, to land lease, land sale, impact fees, etc., etc. And each one becomes more and more complicated and more complex and requires greater and greater requirements. And as you'll see from these arrows, some of them require the money goes into a capital account and straight into infrastructure. If it's property rates, for example, it goes into your operating account and you then use that to raise capital. Now, just last two slides on the conceptual framework. The infrastructure picture here is what we've seen already. So you have the investment you require to make, is you have to build buildings, there's a land purchase, and then there's a whole range of infrastructure, which are the blue blocks. Your infrastructure is divided into internal infrastructure, connector infrastructure, bulk infrastructure, and social infrastructure. Now, the bottom part on the right-hand side is public. In other words, it's assumed that that's in the public realm, it's owned by the city or by some public entity. The buildings themselves are typically provided through the private sector, with the one exception being low-income residential buildings, which are the pink box there, where the public sector is expected to have a role in providing that infrastructure because it's serving poor people. So this is just a map of infrastructure and the expenditure you require to undertake a property development. Now, what we've done here is the same in those boxes. You can see building, land, internal infrastructure, connector infrastructure, bulk infrastructure, etc. That's what you have to spend on a property development in total to have a functional property development. The question is, who spends that money? So this diagonal line shows you how the division comes between the private sector and the public sector. So above that line, the fully shaded things is a situation where the private sector invests, and below the line is where the public sector invests. Now, if you take that 0 point, there you see the convention is that the private sector provides the building, the land, and the internal infrastructure, and the public sector provides the connector infrastructure, the bulk infrastructure, the social infrastructure, and cross-subsidizes low-income housing. Now, that you could call your base point of zero land value capture. As you move to the right, you're having increasing land-based financing. So as you move to the right, the developer may be funding the internal infrastructure, the connector infrastructure, the bulk infrastructure, and so on. As you move to the left, you're getting increasing subsidies. So now the developer is getting a subsidy from the state to fund that infrastructure. So the developer isn't actually covering the cost of internal infrastructure and land, for example. And the developer may even be getting the building subsidized, the houses subsidized. So we're using this diagram to position a property development. On towards the right, high land value capture, towards the left, high subsidies. That's all I've got to say on the conceptual framework. So maybe we can stop for a bit and take some questions, and then we're going to move on to more examples and case studies. Anybody just on point of clarification? Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is David Tilba. I'm a town planner from Zambia. I'd like to congratulate you for the presentation, but I have a problem as an African. I was in the finance institutions.
Nico.
Well, do we have a roving mic? No, we don't.
Can people hear?
He can go there. He can go there on the stage.
The problem I have.
Go to the micro there.
Yes, please.
I'll repeat the question.
Okay.
My problem I have, this model you are given, sorry to say, it works in the developed north. Here in Africa, the global south say, for example, our land is not in the private sector. We have kingdoms or various. I'll talk of Zambia, where I come from. 95% of the land is with our Royal Highnesses.
Yeah.
We only have 5% of the land which is in government, which is used by government, the statutory reserves, the forest, the game park, and the private sector. So I doubt if this model can work in Zambia.
Okay, just to repeat for the translators, I think the question is from this gentleman from Zambia, that does this model work in Africa or in the underdeveloped world, particularly where land is owned by tribal authorities in communal land ownership. So the concern is, how does that model work? I think maybe to answer the question as much as I can, we certainly have found lots of situations where the land is in tribal ownership, and I think the model can work. You can call it, generally it's in the public ownership. So how do you pay the authority who owns it, the tribal authority, for that land then? So in a sense, it's the way the national and city structures work through the tribal authorities. But you're right, it's not specifically mentioned here, and maybe we can come back when we're looking at some of the examples. For example, we've got an example in Lagos where they're working with a chieftaincy to use the land. And of course, a lot of the cities are on the periphery of cities. You're having this transition from tribal land to privately owned land. So it's a good point you're making. Yes.
Hi, I'm Dylan. I'm from the city of Johannesburg, I'm an urban planner. And my question relates to my colleague here from Zambia. In countries, so in the beginning you're not generating enough money in your city to be doing your own financing of infrastructure. So you have to borrow or something to get money to do that investment. But it's quite a big risk. I mean, if it doesn't pay off and create a positive feedback loop in the end, where you are generating your own money, how is that the whole thing will collapse. So how do you sort of balance that risk in financing something towards it generating income later on to build new infrastructure?
Yeah, so just to repeat the question as I understand it, it's from the gentleman's from the city of Johannesburg. It is, if you're starting out without enough finance, in other words, you're a relatively poor city, how do you generate if you want to call it a positive increase in finance to finally actually be able to fund all of the infrastructure that you require in a city? And I guess it's a complex answer, but I guess part of it is by relying on economic growth. In other words, more economic growth, more property development, more opportunities for people to pay. And part of it would, I think, relate to better administrative systems, so you can collect the money that's due to a city for property developments, for land. But I mean, the other part of the answer is sometimes you're just stuck. You don't have enough money, you require money from the state to do the development. When we come and talk about Harare, I think you'll see an example of a city that is stuck, that is struggling to raise any capital at all. So if you can bear with us, and hopefully we can come back and talk about it later as a theme in the discussions. Okay, can we take 3 more questions and then maybe we can move on? Yeah, 1, 2, 3.
Hi, Gary Goliath from the World Bank. I suppose, and the thread that seems to be coming through here is, what can some of the
Could you stand up, Gary, so people can hear you?
my question, I guess, is that I can speak louder too. And I'm much shorter. So my question is, I guess, in sticking with the theme from my City of Johannesburg and Zambian colleague there, is that the cities in different stages of development, would need different enabling factors in order to use these types of tools. So I imagine that there needs to be a regulatory environment that's conducive to its use. I imagine, that there would be certain density requirements within cities that facilitate the use of certain types of tools. In low density and sprawling environments, it's difficult to try to collect these types of financing mechanisms. And the other is that there's property markets that are also at play, and I think that's what the gentleman from City of Johannesburg was hinting at. So my question is, is there a way to illustrate what types of capture tools are available at different points of development, but also what enabling factors need to be in place in order for you to use those tools? Because they can't, it doesn't happen in isolation. That's the one. And then we also didn't touch on any of the sort of urban planning and zoning mechanisms that are available to people that aren't necessarily financed, but they certainly help for the development of a city. And I don't know if that's part of some of the case studies that you'll be doing, or how that plays into some of the questions around what could be applicable in other cities.
Ian, can I suggest that we get all the other questions coming?
Take those 2 questions,
Yeah, just 2 questions, so we can just
One
line
can
up.
carry on, and then you next, and then one person.
Yeah,
Yeah,
if
then
you
you
just come up.
Yeah.
Bonjour. Je viens d'une ville qui s'appelle Moroni, c'est les îles de l'océan Indien à côté des Seychelles. C'est la capitale des Comores et je suis un des premiers adjoints de cette ville. J'aimerais revenir sur l'aspect technique parce qu'on nous a dit qu'il y a plusieurs façons de financer les infrastructures. Nous arrivons à financer quelques infrastructures par des dons privés. Tout simplement parce qu'il y a eu un transfert de compétences dans tous les domaines, mais jusqu'à maintenant, il n'y a pas un transfert financier, ce qui complique la situation. Donc, nous fonctionnons que par des dons privés. L'État actuellement ne donne rien du tout, et nous nous sommes retournés vers les banques pour leur dire, écoutez, nous voulons faire une route, nous voulons faire une gare, nous voulons aménager tel trottoir, donnez-nous un peu d'argent, nous allons vous rembourser d'ici 5 ans, avant la fin de notre mandat, tout au moins. Mais les banques ne nous font pas confiance parce que matériellement et financièrement, ils pensent que nous n'avons pas les moyens de les rembourser. Comment faire pour y parvenir? Et on tourne en rond, on n'arrive pas à avancer. Justement, c'est la question que je pose. Quelles sont les pistes nécessaires pour qu'on puisse en sortir? Merci.
Not everyone's got translation. Are there people here that need to know the question in English? Or? Okay. Yeah, I think this gentleman is from the Seychelles, and I think the point that's being made there is there just is no public finance. So they're very reliant on funding all their infrastructure through private money. And I think the point is being made that the banks can be very difficult about how they provide finance. So they're struggling. In other words, it's completely reliant on the private sector and banks who are controlling the property development process or infrastructure development process. That's just the questions for those that didn't get the French translation.
Trésor Mbaye from University of Johannesburg. I know that in Africa, infrastructure development is mostly political. And we know that sometimes there can be a development that will happen in a certain region for maybe it can be for electoral reason or for other political agenda. So in terms of the tool that you have presented, how did you maybe include the political aspect inside, or maybe the tool is also trying maybe to minimize the political influence so that maybe we can go to the objective that you mentioned before in terms of developing infrastructure that will also bring economic growth.
My name is Budu Manaka. I'm from here in South Africa, from the South African National Biodiversity Institute. In one of the slides, you mentioned different infrastructures that you guys have looked at. But I saw one part talks about social and community, so I assume within there you've bundled the natural capital, because now there's quite a number of debates and communication about ecological infrastructure, ecosystem accounting, but I'm not seeing that coming through, and that will have impact in terms of what comes out when you actually try to come up with, use your tool, when you do the weighing and whatever else.
Just one last question there. Do you want to come through, and then we'll take one last question, and then we'll move on to the next presentation. And can I just ask everybody else who have questions to just hold them to the point where we are discussing all the presentations. So come on.
Merci au présentateur. Moi, j'ai une préoccupation. J'ai écouté avec intérêt pour les outils. Il faut pour financer les infrastructures et arriver au développement local. Je viens d'un pays sous-développé, le Bénin. La terre dans le nord du Bénin ne constitue pas un problème, mais une grande richesse. Cependant, il y a un problème de transfert de fonds. L'État béninois nous aide dans nos communes, mais les ressources vont dans une caisse commune, à savoir le Trésor national. Alors, que faire? Comment mettre à part les fonds des communes et comment aussi transférer les fonds de l'État? Je donne l'exemple d'une commune de mon pays où les gens se battent trop. Ils ont trop de ressources en tant que commune décentralisée. Mais le fait que les ressources vont dans une cagnotte commune fait qu'ils ont beaucoup de ressources qui rentrent, mais ils ont de la peine à dépenser. Ils ont des routes à faire, ils ont des puits à forer, mais le fait que les ressources soient logées dans une cagnotte commune fait qu'ils n'arrivent pas à se développer. Que faire? Comment faire pour séparer les deux cagnottes? C'est mon inquiétude. Et si le conférencier peut nous dire quelles sont les stratégies pour mettre les ressources communales à part et les ressources nationales, ça me ferait beaucoup plaisir. Merci beaucoup.
Can I just, for those of you who don't have translation, just recap on the question being raised. The delegate is from Benin, which she notes is a poor country, particularly in the north. And she's representing a commune in Benin that is obviously wanting to provide infrastructure for the community, for the functioning of the town or, where she's coming from. And the problem they're having is that there is money allocated from a basket fund, a sort of national basket fund, but it doesn't get to the commune. In other words, it's not targeted at infrastructure. So I think the question really is how do you improve the targeting to, if there's infrastructure that's coming from, let's say, a basket fund from the state or donors, to target the infrastructure particularly in poor areas. So it's going to become quite an important theme, I think, in later discussions, so we'll come back to that. Shall I answer?
I think you should answer the others.
I need to get Barbara's notes. Thanks. Yeah, so I think starting off from, I've forgotten, are you from Comoros or Seychelles? Comoros, yeah. I think that the question was in a situation like in the country where this gentleman comes from, they're only getting money from the private sector. So how do you improve your access to that private money? So banks tell you you can't borrow. But I think this is a very good example of what we can take forward in later discussions about how you can use land-based financing. In other words, the developers should be providing you with enough money to fund your roads and your bulk infrastructure, not only the infrastructure within their own areas they're developing. So when we looked at those menus of different ways of raising money, the improvement of land-based financing, say through development charges or whatever charge we want to talk about, is going to be quite important. So if you can bear with us, and I think we're going to take these discussions forward in our later discussions. What are the options for countries such as yourselves? The question around these decisions, I think, around really that you were raising were around the sort of politics of it and how decisions are taken from a political point of view. And clearly there was always politics in property developments, but as far as possible, one wants to have a stable policy, a national policy and a strategy for your city, which takes the politics out of it. And by doing that, what you're trying to make sure is that money is targeted at particularly public money is targeted at poor people. So I'm not sure if I'm following you completely, but I think when we come and talk about it later, that's another quite important reason about when you're setting up your financing system, that you set it up in an agreed policy. And one of the big concerns I think that we all have, and some of the examples you'll see, is that public money from the state goes into funding commercial developments, high income developments, quite often because they're politically motivated. And yet slum upgrading gets put on the back burner because there's not enough political motive to fund it. So we're going to definitely come back and talk about that a bit further. I think the question about the sort of ecologically important infrastructure, we call it green infrastructure, is clearly an important part of the agenda. And the last slide that I showed you of Edgar Peterson, moving towards an adaptive city where your infrastructure has a minimum draw on the environment, is going to be quite important. And I think it can be done. I don't think it's any contradiction with land-based financing, because the type of infrastructure you provide should be structured by a city and by planners and by approving developers' projects. In other words, the developer shouldn't be able to just put in whatever they like. You should be able to set the agenda for what that developer must provide in terms of the type of infrastructure. And in some cases, actually, these more micro, let's call it more micro localized infrastructure opportunities fit quite well with that, because you can say to the developer, we want you to generate your own electricity, say through photovoltaic systems or whatever else you may have. But maybe we'll come and talk a bit about that a bit more, but I don't think there's any contradiction between land-based financing and green infrastructure. So on that basis, I think we're going to carry on, and Barbara's going to change the topic to what's going on in the rest of the world.
So there were a couple of questions I think that will cover under the discussion, just for us to keep up time. I've noted a couple of questions on the social infrastructure that was asked later, and the other one about the enablers that you asked. So if you can just hold on to that, we'll cover those through the discussion. Okay.
It's full of excitement, this session. So bear with me as I deal with the technology. Right. So what I'd like to talk to you now a bit is to share some experiences and some of the discussions that a number of colleagues at my unit and colleagues that were invited from across the world had when Ian and Stephen presented their findings, which they've just been presenting to you. What happened was that in June of this year, the Development Planning Unit in London, where I work, organized a workshop to, first of all, learn from the findings of Stephen and Ian, and also try to bring this conversation about land-based financing for infrastructure in Africa within a broader international context. And another point that for us was very important when we had this conversation, and which you can recognize in the title, this is just a picture of the workshop that we had, is this question about towards the redistributive city. In a sense, we were really keen to sort of hold on to and trying to find out how is it that land value capture can retain its transformative potential, if you want. So these were some of the angles that we had when we were looking and listening to Ian and Stephen, and also listening to some colleagues. We had colleagues who, oops, I have to shift this. Yes, we had colleagues who talked a little bit about land-based financing for infrastructure in the north, so in Europe, North America, Japan, Australia, etc. And what's clear from that is a very long history, but it's also a very diverse history, which reflects strong and very different relationships between state and market within these different countries. The question, of course, which many of you have already asked earlier today, was what does it mean to import such instruments which were mainly developed in northern context to global south context? And global south context, I'm aware, is a really sort of broad catch-all phrase. There's a lot of differences under the global south, but let me be a bit caricatural for the purpose of now, of trying to grasp some issues. Global south, by that we mean context marked by sharper socio-spatial inequalities, in fact what big spatial inequalities in terms of infrastructure. So we're talking of very high-rise developments that we all know, and then of course slum conditions that were described earlier on. Also where government resources are very stretched, where contexts are dominated by informality of living, of working in the cities. So what does it mean to try and introduce instruments like land value captures in such contexts? And we had inputs from Alan Gilbert from Colombia, who talked to us about land value capture experiences in Colombia, especially in Bogota. We had Eliseo Fernandez and Mariana Fix, who talked to us about experiences in Brazil. And then we had Sudesh Namitra and Sheila Patel talking to us a bit about experiences in India. So starting with Bogota, So the story here about Bogota is one of land prices rising very fast over a recent period. So you get some of the figures here. The other interesting character about Bogota, well, about Colombia generally, and particularly in Bogota, is a huge and very long history about with trying to capture land value. And so a whole history of different tools and instruments that have been developed over time. One is the betterment levy, Contribución de Valorización, since 1921, which is a levy imposed on property owners to cover the costs of improvements of general benefit to the public, but also likely to be of specific benefit to the developer, to the property developer. Property tax, impuesto predial, and then a whole host of instruments linked to the urban reform that was initiated in 1989, and subsequent legislation that tried to bolster these urban reform. So some of them are the land banking, which was called, with Metro Vivienda, which was an institution that was set up to administer and run this land banking. Basically, land banking is an attempt by the public authorities to preempt land price increases when you change the land use from rural to urban, and recoup some of this increase to promote the building of social housing, or especially on service land. I can give more detail later if you want. Plusvalia was an attempt to, payment of plusvalia was to challenge land speculation. Plusvalia challenge to land speculation, building on the law of 1997. And it was a key component of new master planning, the introduction of new master planning. The idea was to allow the municipality to recoup from 30 to 50% of land value increment connected to public action, such as changing the designation of rural land into land for urban development or suburban development, modification of zoning or other land use regulation, or modification of regulation towards greater density. And then the last one, which is maybe the most radical still, is controls over speculative land holding. And that was from 2004. The idea was to generate more land for social purposes. The developer had up to 2 years to, basically couldn't stay on its land, had up to 2 years within which it had to sell its land or develop the land. If not in principle, it should be going to auction. And the developer had to dedicate 15 to 25% of any building project to social housing. Oh, okay, so key findings. Key findings. Well, national initiatives have generally been progressive. I mean, you can see a whole array of interesting processes to try and capture land value increases for redistributive purposes. But only large cities have taken advantage of them, and Bogota is by far the one which is sort of the trailblazer. Main message, land value capture is hard. There's a lot of breaks, if you want, on the supposed redistributive intent of the instrument. And that's very much particularly in the case of the most radical land value capture instruments, such as land banking, plusvalia, and control over speculative land holding. Some of the issues involved have been difficulties in valuation methodologies, elite resistance, landowners, conservative political forces, often supported in this process by quite conservative legal challenges and conservative judges that do not help during these legal challenges, complexity of the regulatory framework, intermunicipal competition, etc. Again, if you want, I can, in a question, run through some of the ways in which these different elements affected these various instruments. So the most successful mechanism actually have been possibly the less exciting ones. One of them was this betterment levy, valorization levy, that was, as we saw, introduced very early on in 1921. Effective, but the results it's been mainly effective in better off areas. And then the property tax system has actually been pretty good at recouping land increases. And there's quite well developed sort of bandit tax system, although there's been a lot of problems in irregularities between the banding system. So an interesting story here of innovative land value capture tools, but that in practice are very difficult to implement because there's a lot of political opposition to it, and so municipal authorities sort of reverting to more traditional ways of capturing value, land value. Brazil now. And I have Brazilians in the room, so I feel a little bit... so, there's a quite similar dynamics at play, in a sense, in the Brazilian case. And so the feedback that we had, or rather the presentations from our colleagues, were, in a sense, precautionary about land value capture and its potential its transformatory potential. And maybe the disappointment is bigger because, in a sense, you have in Brazil, in principle, an incredibly supportive constitution and regulatory framework. The constitution, which was adopted after the dictatorship. Oops, sorry, it should be 19. Yeah, no, it's right. Yeah, the 1998 constitution, after the dictatorship, which set off a whole process of urban reform, recognized principles of democratic management of cities, social right to housing, social function of property, recognition of consolidated informal settlements, etc., and the need to combat speculation in urban areas. And after about 13 years of struggle, this city statute that is embedded in law, which is a way of enshrining a right to the city. And in the city statutes, you have some very progressive frameworks which recognize the social function of the city and of property, that separate the right to own land from the right to develop, obligations on municipalities to plan, and to plan for everybody, and also the democratic management of city. And what's interesting is actually that within the city statute, there is a particular instrument that is outlined, a tool for capturing land value for redistributive purposes, which is the CEPAC, the Certificate of Additional Development, Certificate of Additional Construction. Sorry, I have different words. Certificate of Additional Development Potential. Right. Basically, what that CEPAC is it's issued by City Hall and gives the bearer, as in the property developer, additional rights for larger floor area ratios or footprint or ability to change the use of the land, of the plot. And CEPACs are sold in auction, can be sold in auction, or also can be sold through other means. And the revenue is to be expended on infrastructure and or housing. So what has been particular about these CEPACs, this instrument, is that it's been employed, or it's been deployed, sorry, my English is a bit, in context of urban operations. And these urban operations are public-private partnerships too for urban development in a spatially circumscribed part of the city. That is a very important part of these urban operations. Are not, in a sense, you're not extracting value and with the ability to redistribute everywhere. You can only redistribute locally. And São Paulo has been the most proactive municipality to put into operation this CEPAC. So sorry, I have interesting things. So a few things to say about these CEPACs in operation. What work? On the one hand, quite spectacular or quite impressive revenue volumes. You've got the figures here. In São Paulo alone, $2.5 billion in just 8 years. Yeah, 8 years. And only based on 2 of these urban operation zones. And then another learning was that it's been easier to develop these CEPACs, to sell these CEPACs through auction than trying to value incremental calculation. Another thing in its favor is that it's provided quite predictable revenue for infrastructure investment. Developers have been able to plan ahead, and in some cases there's been also integration of slum upgrading obligations instead of cash in CEPAC payment. So some positives. Now, to the more critical element, there are some real challenges. It's really only worked in big cities with sophisticated capital markets, and even then, it's only been working really in areas where market demand is high, which leads to a really important critique about these instruments, which are supposed to be for distribution. Let's not forget about the original purpose, right? Is that it's worsened socio-spatial segregation, because basically these urban operations have only been in parts of the city where land developers are keen to invest. Another critique is that city governments haven't always supported new floor area ratio, thank you, with new infrastructure, and also city governments have prioritized global city infrastructure spending over social housing or social infrastructure in some instances. So in a sense, quite trenchant critiques, or rather a cautionary tale about the redistributive and transformative intents of CEPACs. Despite favorable regulatory framework, the instrument is ultimately predicated on land speculation. And what that means is that impacts social spatial justice principles, because basically nobody is really going to be, or developers aren't really interested in doing urban operations in favela areas. So it really raised the question of using these kinds of tools in context of huge inequalities in cities, or splintered urbanism, if you want to use a technical term. Another issue, of course, is that the social function of property and the collective use that is meant to be integral to the city statute have really been subsumed to individual property rights and the exchange value of land and property. So one of our colleagues who was presenting this experience of Sao Paulo was saying it really has narrowed the possibilities of what the city could be, in a sense overriding the idea of the city statute. So the question that was raised was, can the instrument be transformative in highly unequal contexts? And there we had quite different points of view. Some said, no, let's focus on, because it's so based on land speculation, let's focus on other redistributive mechanisms that are within the city statute. And then others who were saying, well, actually, no, let's not completely let go of it, but actually let's really think of repoliticizing these tools, and more generally, let's repolitize the notion of land governance and land finance mechanism. Either way, the tool in itself is not the panacea, and we're going to come back in the conclusion. So I'm going to quickly go through a last example, which was the Indian example. Again, experience 100 years of land-based financing, different instruments used in different states, but most commonly used in certain states of India, like Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Gujarat. And the most common instrument in town planning law has been area-based development charge. So a charge that when the land use of the land it changes, and it's per unit of area, so per square meter. So the about these area-based development charges is that they've been widely applied, but generally accepted. But because they're based on rates which have not been updated, there hasn't been much revenue that's been that could be extracted from that. Revenues are not buoyant because also they're area-based and not value-based. And it was acknowledged that because they're yielding insufficient revenue, but the problem is that the response of government hasn't been so much to update these rates, but rather to develop additional instruments and levies, which could be potentially a good thing, but at the same time with it comes the risk that it's making more and more complex regulatory environment. So one example, so here are a couple of experiences of supplementing area-based development charge. One is in Maharashtra in 2010, change from valuing by area-based valuing to percent of land value. With sort of the issue that there is that it's based on official value rather than market-based value. So in a sense, the local authorities were not bold enough to go all the way and go into market-related value. So there was only limited buoyancy. Other fiscal instruments have failed because they have been very difficult to implement in the context where you have colonially inherited planning laws which are very receptive to new policies such as land value capturing. Also, there's been attempts to capture land value by paying for regularization, but it's quite a controversial option. And then impact fees, considered and tried, but failed because of absence of reliable, up-to-date capital investment plans. So the story from India is that there's lots going on, but not particularly, nothing that stands out as being particularly productive, as coming as a very good practice, if you want. So this was the main, these were the three main examples that we looked at. And after that, we had a bit of a general conversation around what are, what do these examples raise as questions? And mainly the main question was that land value capture is a tool. In itself, it's not the panacea. It can deliver financial resources for infrastructure, but its transformative potential has to be claimed. So that's the main point. Land value capture is not in itself going to resolve this issue. It has to be claimed because if it is not actively pursued, strong vested interests will do all that they can, and they have a very good, very strong ways of ensuring that the status quo remains, and the status quo generally means continued, very splintered forms of urbanism. And then there was a deeper question which possibly relates to some of the questions that arose during the conversation, which was, but is land value capture really, we need also to question what land value capture is. For what kind of infrastructure are we talking about, and for whom? So what land value capture is there to finance infrastructure, but we don't just want any infrastructure to be financed through land value capture. The idea is, how do you tie land value capture to infrastructure that facilitates a transformative urban policy and infrastructure development? And that means an infrastructure trajectory that isn't going to increase inequality, that is going to be respectful of diversity, that is going to be respectful of informal ways of working and living in the city, and indeed of creating value in the city. And also that is going to be respectful and work with and incorporate notions of ecosystem services, and not lock cities in energy intensive trajectories. So really, the idea was, whilst it's important to focus on the technicalities of how does one implement land value capture as an instrument, because it is quite a complicated instrument, it is absolutely crucial to make sure that we constantly keep that conversation within a normative understanding of what land value capture is for, and also to consider its political economy. So here, just to the last slide, we started having a bit of a conversation about what reinvigorating the transformative potential of land value capture could entail, and there were many. We went in lots of different directions, but I just put two that were particular where there was a lot of conversation. And one was really this notion of, again, which might talk to some of the questions that we've had earlier on already, which is to capacitate local authorities in understanding land and real estate markets, including informal customary land markets. So informal and customary or chieftaincy, communal land markets, so that they can be creative about land value capture tools and its potential. So for instance, that they need to be able, it's quite, learning to assess the extra value that public intervention contributes or takes away, and therefore how much should be recouped for redistribution, or indirectly, how does one negotiate with developers, financiers, households that are going to be entered in unserviced segments, like low-income household, low-income settlements, thanks to public investments such as, for instance, BRT or transport infrastructure. So to see land value capture in a quite creative way, if you want, as a developmental tool, as a tool to engage with transformative, inclusive, sustainable infrastructure and city trajectories. So also, to give that capacities for municipalities to engage with these questions, so that they become much more skilled and apt to negotiate with developers, because that's often a problem. There's a lack of understanding of land markets and property markets, and therefore an inability to be able to be a good negotiator when you're dealing with property developers. And also to become better and creative managers of land markets, but more importantly, champions of more equitable land markets. There is a caveat to all of that, or there's something that needs to come before, and again, we touched some of that in the conversations before, which is that it requires local authority institutional coherence. There was a question around decentralization that came just before, and it does imply that you have a local authority that has some degree of ability to capture value, that has an ability to make own decisions, that you have a specific institutional setup whereby the arm that extracts the value is the same that can distribute. Also, there's certain issues around whether that should be, hopefully that there's a potential to not distribute locally, but to have also a citywide view, to also be able to have integrated local government structures so that land that can be extracted through transport can then feed into housing or health or things like that. So it requires inevitably a degree of local government coherence which needs to be built up. And then the other story, the other really important element of the conversation, and which also probably talks to the political question that was raised earlier, is that there needs to be the same kind of capacitation, if you want, of community groups and a development of a community of practice around land value capture and the kinds of potentials that it can bring. Because, as we saw, many vested interests are likely going to refrain or to hamper, even if you have a nice local government or local authority that wants to do certain things. And so there needs to be a community of community groups that are also aware of land markets and how to use land value capture and how to mobilize around land value capture, how to democratize discussions around land value capture. And also to build evidence of alternative value creation and how that can get into the conversation about what land value capture is about. And we had suggestions about, of course, community groups can't do it all on their own, and how there's alliances that can be built for that to happen, alliances with academics, but also with lawyers, with property economists, etc., etc., etc. So these were some of the conversations that we had. Thank you.
So we also are mindful of time that we lost early on. So what we'll do is just to also that we capture the questions that we have for this particular presentation or comments. I'd like to invite you again to come to the front if you have a question or a comment, so we can capture them. If there aren't too many, I'll ask you to just respond briefly. But yeah, so if you can come forward, that's the drill. So you can come into the mic. And the good thing is that you can hear French, yes, and you can respond in French.
I can try and respond in French,
yeah,
but my French will not very much.
Right. So
je vais m'exprimer en français, si vous permettez. Je voudrais faire déjà une première remarque. c'est que ce que vous nous avez présenté ici montre à suffisance que le travail n'a pas été fait en direction de l'Afrique. L'exemple de l'Inde, l'exemple de Bogota, l'exemple d'autres régions, est-ce que vous pensez que ça s'applique à nous? Parce que si une étude avait été faite, vous aurez perçu tout de suite que la terre, pour le financement des infrastructures, comme nous sommes ici, c'est le thème, appartient à l'État. L'État qui ne veut rien céder aux collectivités locales. Je prends l'exemple du Gabon, où avant le maire était le président de la commission de la vente des terrains, il n'est plus là que pour l'autorisation de construire. Ce qui fait que, au lieu que ces moyens servent à la commune pour effectivement avoir suffisamment d'outils pour financer le développement de la ville, ces moyens sont captés, sont distraits, et d'ailleurs, la plupart du temps, ce sont les responsables du cadastre qui prennent cet argent, qui ne le reversent pas toujours dans les caisses de l'État. Donc ça pose d'énormes problèmes quant à la captation de toutes ces possibilités, potentialités qui existent dans les communes pour pouvoir développer. Le problème est ici la volonté politique qui n'existe pas, de laisser les communes jouer leur rôle. Les gouvernements centraux estiment que laisser une commune se développer avec des hommes et des femmes, ça n'est pas tellement, je l'ai dit ce matin, ça n'est pas seulement la capacité de celui qui est à la tête de la commune, parce qu'il c'est un élu, c'est un politique. On peut aller prendre qui l'on veut. Il y a des techniciens qui sont autour pour implémenter, pour mettre en musique ce que le politique veut. Mais le problème, c'est qu'il y a refus de décentralisation, il y a refus de mettre en place une politique distributive de moyens de l'État et de laisser les collectivités locales s'organiser. Vous voyez un gouvernement qui dit « nous allons construire des logements » et qui veut le faire lui-même sans se servir des outils qui existent, c'est-à-dire que les collectivités locales qui peuvent servir justement de moyens de suivi et d'accompagnement de ce que veut le gouvernement. À partir de ce moment-là, la campagne doit être faite ici. C'est-à-dire que la prochaine fois, il faudra réunir les ministres des Finances et les ministres de l'Intérieur pour qu'on en discute, pour que ce soit efficient, efficace et économique pour l'Afrique. Sinon, je voudrais aussi faire remarquer que la traduction n'a pas été tellement, ça ne nous a pas permis de suivre véritablement ce qui est dit. Mais enfin, ce sont des choses qui arrivent. Il nous revient à nous aussi d'apprendre à parler correctement l'anglais. Merci.
Merci. Okay, so I have a gentleman from the Seychelles, gentleman from Comoros, City of Joburg. If you can also just make your way through to the front, I'd appreciate it. I'm going to put this here so you can see me. So I'm just...
Bonjour. Justement, je rejoins un peu mon collègue, c'est qu'on ne peut pas faire du copier-coller de ce qui vient d'être dit vers l'Afrique. Ça ne va même pas coller. Ça va parler à la campagne directement. Donc, ce que j'ai envie de dire, c'est que dans nos systèmes traditionnels africains, c'est très compliqué le système foncier. Parce qu'il y a des familles où il y a une succession où on ne peut même pas vendre, on ne peut même pas céder. C'est au père, le grand-père, le petit-fils, on ne peut pas céder. C'est très compliqué. Et en revenant à ce que je viens de dire tout à l'heure, il y a transfert des compétences, pas de transfert financier. C'est que je vous donne l'exemple de notre commune, la ville de Moroni, qui est la capitale des Comores. Tout ce qui appartient dans la ville, pour eux, ça appartient à l'État central. Si on veut construire quelque chose, c'est très difficile. C'est un combat de tous les jours. Donc je voudrais avoir des éclaircissements là-dessus si on vient dans des difficultés pareilles. Il y a des terrains qui sont là, mais l'État central s'exerce dans la capitale. C'est à nous, l'État central. Donc, c'est un peu compliqué toute situation. J'aurais bien aimé qu'on essaie de développer ça, même une prochaine fois, pour essayer de nous en sortir dans ces difficultés. Merci.
I've just got two questions. They're quite simple questions, but I don't think they've got simple answers. The first one is how do we avoid gentrification with land value capture? In the city of Johannesburg, we've got a project called the Corridors of Freedom. We're putting in infrastructure. We anticipate land value going up, but how are we going to stop the poor getting pushed out by that? And the second one that's related to that is, do you know of any mechanisms that can allow the poor to also benefit from this this increase in land value? So not just the state, not just society in general, but in Soweto is a good example. If you put in infrastructure, people own property, but generally don't leverage the increase in that property to develop their own property, for example, and leverage funds for themselves of that too. So those are the two questions.
Thank you very much. Are they hard questions?
Yes.
You can pass them on to your next presenter.
I will. But let me just quickly answer. Alors, donc je vais essayer de répondre en français. Tout à fait d'accord avec vos commentaires du Gabon qui rejoint ceux plutôt du Bénin et vos commentaires des Comores. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait dans un contexte où il n'y a absolument pas de volonté de décentralisation? Et c'est sûr que les exemples que nous montrons, enfin, le petit NB là, Requires Local Authority Institutional Coherence, fait exactement allusion à cette question-là. Et il est sûr que land value capture dans des contextes où on a un État centralisé qui ne veut, où il y a je vais avoir du mal à m'exprimer en français. Donc oui, enfin un immense trou entre ceux qui, enfin gap là, entre ceux qui captent la valorisation foncière et ceux qui la redistribuent. Votre suggestion enfin, ce qu'il faut en effet, c'est de développer, comme on appelait ici aussi, une community of practice pour mettre en valeur la nécessité d'une décentralisation qui doit se faire à plusieurs échelles. Et vous aviez raison d'indiquer l'échelle d'essayer d'influencer les décideurs, mais aussi en effet de construire, de renforcer les mobilisations citoyennes et des collectivités qui souvent peuvent se mettre ensemble pour justement réclamer davantage de décentralisation. C'est un combat à longue haleine, ça sans aucun doute. Sur la question des Comores, alors le système foncier est très compliqué. Le système foncier est très compliqué. Et il est certes très compliqué en Afrique, mais il est très compliqué aussi dans d'autres endroits. Il est évident que les présentations que nous avons de nos collègues allaient plutôt dans la direction de cas où il y a eu surtout le Brésil et la Colombie, où il y a eu des expériences intéressantes de captation de la rente foncière. Parce que l'idée, c'était justement essayer d'un peu s'en inspirer, de voir qu'est-ce qu'on pouvait en apprendre. Mais même au Brésil, certainement en Inde, il y a aussi énormément de différences marchés qui se juxtaposent. Et la question tout à fait pertinente que vous avez posée, c'est comment essayer de faire en sorte que l'on transforme, que l'on nuance cet instrument qui est le land value capture pour s'adapter à des contextes différents plutôt que d'essayer de faire rentrer les contextes différents dans un moule qui ne leur convient pas du tout. Donc il y a un énorme travail à faire, il est vrai, pour réfléchir à ce que cette notion de captation de la rente foncière peut dire dans des contextes très différents. Alors, bon, il y a des collègues qui travaillent déjà sur ça dans le continent africain, et nous allons, enfin, je sais qu'on va avoir une réunion avec certains de ces collègues en juin prochain, et donc je serai ravie d'en parler davantage avec vous à ce moment-là. Mais c'est vrai qu'il y a aussi, il faut apprendre il y a énormément de valeurs qui se créent, pas seulement dans les marchés formels, et il faut savoir comment s'engager avec ces processus. Donc je comprends la question, mais d'un autre côté, il faut la détourner un petit peu aussi. Et alors par contre, sur les questions de Johannesburg, comment faire en sorte qu'on évite la gentrification, je ne sais pas si on dit ça en français, dans les cas de... On dit ça oui, on dit ça. Donc comment faire en sorte d'éviter la gentrification dans les cas de oh, I should switch to English maybe. How to avoid gentrification when you have land value captures? It's a huge question, and I don't think there's any easy answers. So I'm going to hope my colleagues are going to help to join me. I think that's certainly something that came up in our discussions, and that's why we put the emphasis on these two elements, because we thought that both having that sometimes gentrification can be the product of municipal agents who are not necessarily aware of how these property dynamics work. And how to negotiate. I mean, it's not just in the African continent. I'm seeing it, I live in London at the moment, and I see it in the boroughs, because we work with community groups that are facing exactly the same questions. So we thought that these two elements were part of that response, but it would be fantastic to hear from my colleagues and from everybody in the audience what are some of the suggestions that come up. The last one, I'm afraid, I don't know. I'm also not even sure that I fully captured your question. So I'm hoping that Ian and Stephen will pick up. Sorry.
Thank you, Barbara. We'll take the next presentation from Stephen. Stephen, I understand you're speaking to the land-based finance in Western Central Africa?
No.
No.
I'm going to talk about the case study work that we did in the 3 cities of Addis Ababa, Harare, and Nairobi. Let me get the right slide. This is not the most state-of-the-art machine. There we go. Yeah. Okay. So there's a typo there. It shouldn't say leasing. So comparative study lessons. Although there is some leasing involved. Before I start these slides, I thought I might just pick up some of the points that were raised in relation to Barbara's presentation, because they really feed into this what I'm going to talk about. And so what I'm talking about is reflecting on the practical work that we did in terms of going out to find out what was happening with land-based financing in practice in African cities. We chose these 3 cities because we were trying to get a range of African city contexts, within certain parameters. So for instance, none of us on the research team speak French, or Portuguese. So we were restricted to cities that operate primarily in English. And we were also restricted to cities we were directed towards cities in which we already, through other work, had access to decision makers and to professionals. Perhaps what we were looking at here was we did a preliminary piece of work where we identified what we thought were the factors for successful land-based financing. And those factors, when we drew up those factors, and this goes right back to David Tembo's point earlier about whether this could work in Africa. And what we came up with a set of factors for good land-based financing. That once you went through, you need to have an effective state, you need to have good governance, effective cities, access to finance, a relatively open and transparent and active land market, the capacity to provide infrastructure. When we looked at these factors, many of these factors are not present in African cities. But all of our cities have elements of each of various of these factors. And when we looked at when we start to look at the challenge of financing infrastructure in our cities, and look at the very limited range of alternatives to doing that, when we look at the ways in which our commercial real estate markets are working, often at a very high level, in many ways out of synchronization with the rest of the city, it's clear that we've got to devise ways of working with land-based financing, of harnessing the rising land values in our cities in order to better finance infrastructure. And this brings us back to the points that Barbara was raising. And so some of the diagrams that Ian had up at the beginning. Ideally, we want to use the revenues raised through land-based financing for redistribution. In our experience, there's a first step we've got to get to before we can even think of redistributive expenditure. And that is, we've got to get commercial developments to pay their way. They've got to cover the costs of the infrastructure that the city and in some cases national governments are providing. And linked to that is that we've got to eliminate the very prevalent situation in many of our cities where effectively public money is financing private development, is subsidizing private development. And so this, if we're looking at the political economy of urban infrastructure and urban development, the first step that we can see, and this is what I'm going to talk about when we reflect on some of these cities' real experiences, is that we've got to get developers and the consumers of the development's products, whether they be residential units or commercial or industrial units, to pay their way for the infrastructure that they're using, so that public money is available for the really crucial redistributive expenditure which we need. I think the point about gentrification is a crucial one as well. I think it's one of the great conundrums of urban development is whatever we invest in a piece of land, whether it be a BRT system through a commercial center, or even simply the allocation of a defensible title to land in an informal settlement, what we are doing is raising the value of that land. And within that, there's as soon as that value goes up, we're limiting the access that people who are less well off can have to that. We can't stop investing in infrastructure, we can't stop investing in land administration, but we've got to become more mindful of the ways in which we do that in order to ensure that it has a more equitable outcome. I'm going to talk now about the three cities that we looked at. Really, just at the risk of oversimplifying, we looked at Addis Ababa because it is a city which in many ways is fueled by and driven by land-based financing. Something which is made possible by the fact that the state, similar to many African countries, the state owns all of the land. That already immediately puts the state in a potentially advantageous position. Not all states that own the land take advantage of that position to benefit the poor, but they're in a very advantageous position to influence the way in which the city grows and develops. And Addis Ababa is a good example of such a city. We chose Nairobi because it is a city which has an incredibly hot property market. There's great demand for real estate in Nairobi. There are real problems with supply of real estate, with underlying land administration, and there's almost no land value capture or land-based financing that is taking place within this this fevered speculation that drives the Nairobi land market. And then we looked at Harare as an example of a city under huge stress, under governance stress, fragile governance, very conflictual politics, and an almost total economic collapse. And if we look at the range of cities across our region, most of our cities fit to a greater or lesser extent into one of those categories, or certainly parts of our cities do. And so we thought that we could learn useful lessons from seeing what was happening in these three locations. So I'm going to start just with a quick overview of each city, then to look at, and I think a really important part of it which was raised earlier, is the governance issues within the city and the institutional arrangements around infrastructure investment and infrastructure finance in the city, the land development context in the city, and then each city's practical experience of what actually happened when they've tried to do land-based financing, and finally a set of conclusions per city. So Addis Ababa, the interesting thing I noticed, these are all cities that are roughly the same age as the city we're in right now, Johannesburg. So they're all between 100 and 130 years old, and it's fascinating to see what different trajectories these four cities have taken. Addis Ababa it's a fast-growing city, it's a fast-growing economy. It's one of the fastest-growing cities in the world, and it has a very complex governance history, certainly over the last 20 years, of political struggles over the governance of the city and struggles between the national and the local level, which has profoundly influenced the current arrangements that are in place now in Addis Ababa for the management of the city. Nairobi is a city where it's quite difficult to work out exactly how many people live there. It's certainly more than 3.5 million people. It's also got a very fast economic growth rate. It's interesting, all three cities have fast economic growth rates from different bases. Certainly in the case of Harare, from an almost total collapse, the current rates of growth are fast. They're all growing in population terms. In Nairobi, the new constitution has given significantly greater responsibility to city government, but hasn't differentiated city government from other forms of local government. Harare, again, a fast-growing city, going through a period of economic restructuring, great political tension, very different development visions for the city from national and city government, a new constitution that theoretically gives the city greater powers, but which in practice fails to do that, and a rapid urbanization, often manifested in the peri-urban areas rather than in the more central city areas. It's interesting that in order to generate revenue from land development, there's got to be a degree of economic growth in the city, and there are different ways of measuring that. But the two key drivers of that are per capita income and population growth. And it's interesting to see that the cities, in all cases, the GDP per capita, these are, you can have we compared them, each one to the city of Cape Town, just to give some perspective. You can see on the far left of each diagram is the average, then the city of Cape Town, then Addis Ababa, Harare, and Nairobi. And you can see already the very different levels of per capita income and disposable income, and also the very different rates of population growth. For instance, comparing Cape Town and Addis Ababa, in population growth terms, you can see these are cities at very different stages of population expansion, and that has implications for the sorts of land development processes that are happening as well. This is a summary of the three cities' legal and constitutional positions in relation to government as a whole. In Addis Ababa, it operates within a federal system where the city has the same constitutional status as a regional state, or a province, or a state in some countries. And so the city has a very key status that is higher than many other municipalities in the country. It also has a substantial range of functions devolved to the city. All the key most of the key infrastructure provision functions are devolved to the city, and the city also has through the country's constitution, the city shares in the national tax revenue because it is at the same level as a region or a state or a province. A city that we would conventionally see of as a third level of government operates in the Ethiopian federal system as a second level of government, which means that the city has access to substantially stronger and more reliable flows of funds for capital investment. So that immediately starts to put Addis Ababa in a particular category. Nairobi, on the other hand, is within a two-tier system. So in Kenya, you have the national government, you have county government. And the city of Nairobi is a county. There's, in principle, again, in terms of the constitution, there's substantial devolution, but in practice, there's very limited, or there's less ambitious devolution of practical powers to date. The city also, and partly as a result of that, has limited own revenue sources. The property tax system is out of date, and there's only very limited water and sanitation tariff income. This city, though, in terms of a formula applicable to all counties in Kenya, it does receive a substantial transfer of funds from the national government, in this case nearly half of the city's total revenue. The city of Harare is operating within what is in theory a three-tier system. In practical terms, it operates in a two-tier way. There has been processes in Harare of both devolution of powers to the city and then retraction of powers back to national government, and then subsequent re-devolution of powers to local government. This has mirrored the political trends in Zimbabwe, which have been very difficult over the past 20 years. And so you have quite incomplete and uncertain allocation of powers and responsibility for infrastructure finance in the city of Harare. The city has very weak revenue base. Its own revenue base is very weak, and many of its sources of revenue have been stripped from the city and taken up to national government, or are being constantly challenged by national government. So already we see three cities in very different positions in relation to their national governments. These are maps that we did, or diagrams that we did, to start to look at the institutional maps. These are really interesting maps to do for all your cities, if you have the time and inclination. And just to explain these circles, there's what we've got is we've got different. We don't have pointers, so it's in each ring there is a different color. So there's blue or orange or green, and those correspond to the table at the top, and that would indicate whether the city is responsible for both the asset and the management of the operating the infrastructure. The green is if it's blue, so that's the full package of management responsibility for the infrastructure. Green is when the city is responsible only for the operational responsibility, but not the asset or the capital investment responsibility. And orange is where the city is responsible only for the assets, but not the operation. Or not the city, but whichever of the entities is reflected in each of the rings. So the inner ring. So if you are looking at a fully empowered city, the inner ring, which reflects a city department responsibility, would be completely blue. The inner ring. You can see already in Nairobi there are only two small blue wedges in that blue ring. In the outer ring, which is a city-owned parastatal, you might say for a city with devolved responsibilities, it's the first two rings between them should all be blue, should cover everything in blue. For water supply and sanitation, there is a water board and a city water and sewage company that are responsible for water through a city-owned parastatal and a regional parastatal. So you see already the city itself, through its own departments, has no water and sanitation responsibility. If we look at the bottom segment, electricity, all of the electricity responsibility sits outside of the city's mandate. There's no blue in the inner circles in that bottom segment for electricity. So what these diagrams do, these institutional maps do, is show the institutional fragmentation which faces cities. And the great, if we're looking at raising money in order for cities to invest in infrastructure to better serve the needs of their citizens, we've got to get institutional arrangements that strengthen that logic much more than, for example, this one does in the case of Nairobi. Again, if we look at roads and transport, which is that outer top left ring, again, almost all of the responsibility sits outside of the city's authority. This is the case of Harare. Because you'll see in Harare there's a lot of blue, but there's sort of hatched blue and slashed blue and dotted blue. And that's partly because of the contested nature and the uncertain allocation of responsibilities and the fluctuating responsibilities in that city. And that's a scenario that's not uncommon in cities in our region, where it's not completely clear who's responsible for which aspects of which infrastructure service. The city of Addis Ababa, already we start to see much more color in the inner circles, but still some important slashes of blue around the electricity and roads and transport. So these are sort of diagrammatic ways to look at how to get a more sensible alignment of mandate and responsibility in order to strengthen the argument for promoting land-based financing in a city. The other point, and this again I think David raised in context of Zambia, is the ownership of the land in the city is a crucial factor that determines the possibilities for achieving land-based financing. Certainly in many of our cities, particularly in the peri-urban areas into which the cities are expanding, there is land under customary management, customary or ownership by chiefs and tribal authorities, and that is a significant difficulty that many cities face. Interestingly, in these three cases, that didn't really arise. And that perhaps was a weakness in the selection of the cities that we chose. But even in the cities where it does occur, there tends to be a process of, as the city expands formally, of reclassifying land that is under customary ownership and bringing it into the more formal system. I'm not pretending that's a simple or straightforward process, but that is a process that happens in one way or another. The interesting point in Ethiopia, as I mentioned earlier, and again, this is a feature that is common in many of our cities, particularly in a number of the Francophone and certainly the two main Lusophone countries, where Ethiopia similarly, the state owns all the land. There's almost nothing in private ownership. And so the only way in which people or businesses can access land is through a lease. And if we go back to some of Ian's earlier diagrams, once you're leasing land, you've as a city, you've already got significant influence over the financing arrangements, the charges, the levies that you're able to require the leaseholders to pay in return for those leases. And so your potential in that context to do land-based financing is in many ways much stronger than when you have primarily private ownership. In Kenya, there's also a leasehold system, but it's a leasehold system that much more closely resembles private ownership. It's a leasehold system that's been in place for more than 100 years. The Ethiopian leasehold system has been in place since 1974, with some significant changes made to that in 1991. So in Kenya, it is primarily a private market, and it's private to private transactions, although the underlying land tenure form is leasehold. And again, that is a pattern that we see in many of our other cities. In Zimbabwe, in Zimbabwe reflects a number of the, particularly what you call in the sort of the former settler countries such as South Africa and Namibia, the land in the city is primarily privately held. Recently, there's been significant state interference in property rights and land rights in Zimbabwe, particularly on the periphery and the peri-urban areas, but increasingly in relation to land holdings even within the city. So again, we see a complex and a wide range of different land holding patterns in the three cities. And then finally, we have very different notions of who the developer is. Underpinning the land-based financing model is the need to have developers. Businesses who are in the business of securing the rights from landholders as well as from state bodies to develop land, to take a risk, and to sell or to rent out the asset that they've built to consumers and users. And so the land-based financing system works on a interplay, on a relationship between city authorities and developers. And so we look then at, in the different cities, the different types of developers that emerge. In Ethiopia, when the state releases land to developers, the state determines how much land the developer gets, it sets the price, and it prescribes the development parameters. So the developer, in effect, takes on very little risk. The developer knows exactly what they're getting. So as in many ways, the developer operates as more of a construction firm than a developer, because it is everything is set from the outset. All of the financial inputs are cast in stone at the beginning. In Kenya, there's a tight and complicated set of relationships between politicians and land speculators and developers. The developers there are many developers in Kenya. And sometimes I joke, when you go to Nairobi, it's hard to find someone who doesn't say that they're a developer. Everybody's looking at this market and trying to look at development opportunities. And the political structures of the city and of the country are deeply involved in that process. In Zimbabwe, there is a core of traditional developers in the conventional sense of a business that takes on the risk of development opportunities. The weakened economic situation has weakened that sector of the economy, and instead what has emerged on the periphery of a city like Harare are people referred to as land barons, who are speculators, again working with the consent, sometimes the tacit consent, sometimes the overt consent of the city authorities, and accessing land in different ways and providing that land, in many cases providing all the infrastructure for that land quite independently of the city authorities. a common feature in all the three cities is problems with service provision. And this goes back to those three institutional maps, which started to show the very fragmented nature of the institutional arrangements for service delivery. I'm not going to go through the slide in any detail, but there are serious service delivery problems in all of the cities. They're all improving, perhaps with the exception of Harare, but and certainly in Addis and Nairobi, there are advanced, and in Addis particularly, significant examples of infrastructure in big new city-making projects, such as the light rail systems in Addis, which has already started operating and is in the advanced planning stages in Nairobi. And of course, in relation to all of this infrastructure delivery and service delivery, there are high levels of informality and extra legal service delivery happening in all three cities. This is just to show you a profile of the infrastructure finance in each city. Again, comparing to Cape Town, the budget that is provided here is it's not the budget for all infrastructure in the city, but it's the budget that the city controls for infrastructure, which is why you see Harare with a larger budget than Nairobi, which in practical terms, there's a great deal more money being invested in infrastructure in Nairobi than in Harare. But the city controls a much smaller, in Harare, the city controls a larger proportion of the total infrastructure spend. But then the bottom row is especially important, and it really starts to indicate some of the parameters and some of the constraints facing these cities in infrastructure provision. It's the percentage of the city's total budget that is allocated to capital investment in infrastructure. And you can see that moves from a city like Addis, which is thundering away at infrastructure provision, spending nearly half of its budget in capital investment, to Harare, which barely manages to scrape together 2% of its budget for capital investment. And I think that again, is an important reality check when we start to look at the scope for cities in our region for investment in infrastructure, and it underpins the need for additional sources of finance for infrastructure investment, and certainly what we would argue is it underscores the argument for strengthening the instruments for land-based financing. I'm going to just skim quickly through the actual practices in each of the cities. As I've mentioned already, in Addis, the main, because the city owns the land, they determine how people access the land, and there are two ways you access land. The one is you get it allocated to you, and that's really for public service projects, so government buildings, international agencies, churches, embassies, and so on. Also, manufacturing industries or other projects that are deemed to have regional or national significance, and there's a base price set by the city, and that land is allocated on application to people who wish to use land for those purposes. Other property for commercial uses, for residential, particularly for higher income residential, is allocated by auction. And so there's an auction that's held, and the price is determined, and then you pay the price that you bid on the auction. The land lease payments constitute just under 10% of the overall revenue of the city, and 20% of the city's capital finance. It's interesting to note that 94% of the land is allocated at the base price, so on that left-hand column, not auction. 6% is what's auctioned on commercial terms. This is an example of the transformation of a part of Addis that in the last 10 years has changed from the top picture, it's called Kasanchis, the top picture and the bottom picture shows what has been developed through the auction of land leases to private developers, to construction interests in Ethiopia. You can see it's a dramatic change in a relatively, in fact, an extraordinarily short period of time. About 10, 15 years ago, I worked a lot in Ethiopia, and it looked exactly like it does in the top picture. And now it looks like it does in the bottom picture. It's a very profound illustration of what can be done through land-based financing. The great caveat in the Ethiopian case is the costs that have been paid in terms of democratic governance and human rights and freedom of expression and political association. So in all city growth processes there are trade-offs, and if you're an opposition politician in Addis, you would feel quite differently about pictures like this than people who are interested in infrastructure finance and real estate development do. In Nairobi, what we see is significant in-kind contributions, where developers, often because of the limited city capacity, provide the infrastructure themselves. So instead of the developers paying cash sums to the city, they provide substantial infrastructure. There is an infrastructure levy that is, in terms of the applicable town planning law, has to be paid, but it doesn't go into infrastructure costs. It disappears into a municipal account. And what we also see increasingly in the Nairobi context is what we call reverse value capture, where instead of the conventional approach of the city providing bulk infrastructure and the developer providing internal services, the developers have managed to persuade the city authorities to increasingly provide internal services. Again, a case of public money financing private profit and private business. Harare similarly has an endowment fund. Developers have to contribute 10% of the property value if they are putting in a development through the formal system, through the applicable town planning legislation. But again, those funds are not used for infrastructure, and they go into the city's general expenses. In some ways, there's a good reason for that, because the city is unable to pay its officials their salaries. And so whatever money is there, they need to pay salaries with. And again, because of very limited city capacity, developers are substantially making in-kind contributions. So just to sum up, in the city of Addis Ababa, there is the fiscal financial arrangements are a huge advantage. The city's ownership of the land is a huge advantage. The practical difficulty is that they are even at the fast pace at which they are developing, they're unable to keep up with demand. And so prices are increasingly high, and it is increasingly difficult for poor people to access land. That's compounded by the fact that they are displaced by the city. The city, because the city owns the land, the city is very powerfully placed to remove poor people who are occupying land that goes out on a lease. And so the picture in Addis Ababa is a very dramatic, it's a very significant, for some people it's an inspiring picture in terms of physical manifestations of growth, but in terms of incorporating and empowering and strengthening poor communities, there I think is a long road ahead still to travel. So again in Nairobi, as I've mentioned before, there are problems in the governance system that have to be addressed if there is to be effective land-based financing. that's first needed to establish a rational alignment of powers and functions around both the raising of revenue and the investment of money into infrastructure, but also to establish the political will necessary to protect the revenue streams from land-based financing for infrastructure investment. In Harare, there's a high demand for property. There's certainly in the peri-urban areas, through informal processes, there is significant supply of land, and there's also a good value capture instrument in the endowment that set at 10% of the value of the project. But this is constrained by the issue, I think, that our colleague from the Comores raised. It's very difficult to access finance for infrastructure if you're a developer. The municipality has very little money to invest. The infrastructure backlog is dauntingly huge, and the quality of urban governance is poor. So the challenges there are significant. Just to sum up, I think we've wanted to look at what we're very aware of the risk of setting an ideal set of requirements for land-based financing without grounding it in the reality of the way in which our cities actually run and actually are managed. It's clear that pursuing land-based financing is not a straightforward overnight exercise that we can wake up and decide to do tomorrow. But if we look at the futures of our cities, we look at the other available streams of revenue for infrastructure investment, it's clear that we've got to start strengthening the factors that are within our control as city governments particularly, in order to better equip ourselves to take up this challenge incrementally and progressively over time. Thanks.
I just wanted to say that the next presentation, which is a final presentation, we certainly do not want death by presentation, but it's the final presentation which also talks to the subject. And it's going to take about 15 minutes for Ian to present this, and then we can open up a more general conversation here. So Ian, do you want to just take that up, and then we'll announce the website.
We realize we've taken too much time on the presentations, but also partly because we lost 20-25 minutes over the delay. So what I'm going to do is not, as Lindy suggests, we won't take questions. I'll go very quickly through this last section, which is on Western Central Africa, and then we'll leave ourselves half an hour, 3/4 of an hour to close off, and particularly to have a debate. What we've been asked to do is also to reach some conclusions between us as to what we'd like to take forward to be as an output of the Africities session. So I'm going to zip through this quite fast, so apologies to all of you that come from Western Central Africa. This was not we didn't have a chance to do detailed case studies as we did for Nairobi, Addis and Harare. But what we've done, we've looked at a scan of property developments. So what we did was we wanted to ask the question is, who was responsible for funding property developments and associated infrastructure? How could we get a quick picture of what was going on? So we did the scan all around sub-Saharan Africa, and we're picking the Western Central African example simply because to prove that we're not biased towards South Africa and Southern and Eastern Africa. So we took 8 property developments, very many case studies. They were done in a few days on a very small budget. but they've shown us some really interesting things about what's going on with property development and who's paying for what and where is land value or land-based financing working. So we covered 5 countries and 6 cities, as you will see. So here are the 8 studies. Each one is a property development, and each one has certain characteristics, starting with Benin at Cotonou. The project name was Akonville. Sorry, the people here who may know about these things, and forgive us if we haven't got our facts 100% right, but I think we've got the picture right. So here we have a housing project developed, intended for low to middle income housing, but not affordable to low income housing, so missing the market. In Cameroon, in Douala, Sawa Beach, mixed use, mainly housing for middle income. Another project in Cameroon, in Yaoundé, the Olembe housing project, again housing for middle income. In Côte d'Ivoire, at Abidjan, we had the Abidjan golf course, clearly high income, intended for high income, mixed use development. So it was a golf course with all the beautiful golf course estate things attached to it. Another Côte d'Ivoire project, my French doesn't really pronounce it very easily, l'Opération La Florence, something like that. Excuse me, all you French-speaking people. A housing project with some commercial. In Nigeria, in Lagos, Carlton Gate Estate, mixed use, mainly housing middle to high income. In Rwanda, 2 projects, both in Kigali, quite different actually when you see the facts. The one would be Gakuriro Estate, and the other one is Kapusho Estates Phase 1 and 2. So quite a nice spectrum of projects, all of them with some housing component. So what we're trying to answer is, what was the role of the national government and the city in these projects? In Benin, heavy involvement by national government, both as a facilitator and funder. In Cameroon, the national government plays a key role in housing developments. They have a major program to roll out housing. There are questions about whether they're targeting the lower income. In fact, when I conclude on this, you'll see this extent to which this actually meets the target market. In Côte d'Ivoire, the national government is heavily involved with the first project, but much less with the second one at the Abidjan Golf Estate. So you get variable levels of government involvement. In Nigeria, very low level involvement by the Lagos state and national government. So developers left pretty much to their own devices. In Rwanda, the government provided land and bulk and connector infrastructure for the one project, for Kapusho. But in the other one, the developer had to fund the bulk and connector infrastructure. So you have a different approach to who funds infrastructure and, in a sense, how land-based financing is working. In accessing land, how was land accessed? In Benin, it was subsidized by national government. In other words, the land was made available largely free. In Cameroon, the national government or city in working together provide the land generally at no cost. Keep in mind, these are mostly middle to high income developments. In Côte d'Ivoire, the land was subsidized in La Florissant, but not in Abidjan Golf Estate. In Nigeria, this was a good example of a situation with traditionally held land. In this case, it was held by a chieftaincy, and they had a joint venture with the developer. So the land was made available from the chieftaincy to the developer and hence sold on to private owners. And in Rwanda, the land was provided free. So generally, land fairly heavily subsidized. Who provided the bulk and connector infrastructure? Benin, national government funded it. In Cameroon, national government funded the bulk and connector infrastructure and also some internal infrastructure in the Olembe project. So you're getting heavily subsidized developments here. In Côte d'Ivoire, the national government funded the bulk and connector infrastructure. In Nigeria, the bulk was in place, but the developer did the connector infrastructure. In Rwanda, as the same thing had happened before, the government provided the bulk and connector infrastructure at Kaposho, but in Gakurilo, the developer had to provide a large proportion of the bulk and connector infrastructure. So, we return to this diagram. I'm sorry if it's maybe difficult to follow. This is a diagram that, exactly the same diagram that I presented earlier. So the diagram is intended to show this is the total spectrum of costs, who funded the costs. Is it on the right-hand side of the diagram, where the private sector funds a large proportion of the Balkan connector infrastructure, and that's what we would call high value capture? Is it on the left-hand side of the diagram, where the state is actually funding the internal infrastructure, possibly the land and possibly even the buildings? So what we're interested in is to look at how property development is positioned here. So here they are. Here they're positioned on each of the projects, positioned as far as we could understand it. And you can see a large proportion of these projects are heavily subsidized. In other words, the government, typically the national government, is funding the internal infrastructure, sometimes, most often the land, and on a few occasions the building. So Sawa Beach, Akonville, Olembe, Gaposho, Abidjan Golf Estate, even Abidjan Golf Estate, and the Abidjan projects, they're subsidized projects. The only two that we could find in this particular sample which had high land value were Gakariro in Kigali and Carlton Estate. So what we were looking for was situations where the developer was funding Balkan Connector infrastructure, and we were finding quite a few examples. And this is a particular concern for all of us, because essentially what's happening is public funds from the government are going to fund middle to high income property developments and not going to fund slum upgrading or housing for the poor. Now, if we can come back to two of the most important mechanisms for land value capture. The first one is in-kind contributions, where the developer builds the connector infrastructure or the bulk infrastructure. So we have got some examples here. It's very common in sub-Saharan African cities. Nairobi, as people were saying, particularly common. Nobody else is going to do this for you, so you go and build it yourself as the developer. You put in the wastewater treatment work sometimes, you put in pipelines to connect to the system, you sometimes put in the connector road. So the two examples we found, best examples, as you saw from the previous slide, were Carlton Estate and Gakariro in Kigali. Where do we have once-off charges or taxes? In Côte d'Ivoire, there's an urban development levy. It's levied on all urban real estate developments, and the proceeds are supposed to go to urban infrastructure. So this is in the nature of a development charge. And I think we wanted to highlight in our recommendations today the importance of having development charges and the role they can play. In Nigeria and Rwanda, there are various charges levied on property developments, but they're regulatory taxes. They're not intended to fund infrastructure, so we don't call them land-based financing mechanisms. Land leasing. You saw the classic example of land leasing that Stephen was describing in Addis, but Cameroon also has a land leasing system. It's not as, let's call it, a powerful situation where the state has got much control, but they do raise a lease charge on the property. We couldn't find any evidence that it was applied to infrastructure. So the conclusion, on the these 8 case studies, on balance, there's a low level of application of land-based financing in Western Central Africa. In fact, the projects indicate some relatively high levels of subsidy for housing to middle and high-income households. However, there are these exceptions that I've mentioned, the in-kind contributions in Nigeria and Rwanda, the development charge applied in Côte d'Ivoire, and the land leasing in Cameroon. There's clearly much to be done in the region to expand on the use of land-based financing mechanisms. So that's the same across the board. We have interest, just for interest's sake, we have also included Lusophone countries. We're just giving you a sample. So we did include 2 property developments in Luanda, we had a property development in Maputo. So there are more than we've shown you here, and the story remains more or less the same, but there are some places where land-based financing is taking place, but all too often it's too little and it's too unstructured. So I think I'm going to leave it there, and in order for us to use the last bit of your energy and concentration, because you've been sitting through a long time here. But first of all, we can have some general discussion or general questions on either of the last 2 presentations, and then we will move towards perhaps speculating about some conclusions we can leave with today. And we will definitely be finished by 6.
but I think I'm going to ask our presenters to just bring their chairs to the front so we can face our participants, and then we can have that exchange. And I'm going to invite everyone who wants to speak. Either you are asking a question or you have a comment, to just come to the front. We are limited, unfortunately, by the fact that we just have this one mic, and you have to come up here and speak to it. There are questions. We've entertained questions after each and every presentation. We've taken the last two presentations in succession because they are very linked, and it was just an expansion of the case studies that we were looking at. But I'm going to just put these points out there so that when we reflect and when we talk, we may want to touch on them as participants. So the floor is open to you. But I think the things that have come up that we just want to structure the conversation on, please don't be limited by this, but be guided by it. The first thing is equitable access to infrastructure. Just how do we ensure that the poor also get their attention? There were questions that were asked earlier by some of the participants. Some of them have left. The second is, which instrument would work the best? I mean, from your own experiences, maybe some of them have not been covered here, but in terms of what you've heard, which instrument would you think should work the best? This is what's supposed to actually just get us through to us finishing with the conclusions that we give to the conference organizers. And then finally, if there are any comments around the capacity of the organizations or the cities to engage with some of these tools for development that we've had here today, and any others that we may not have had. So I'm going to open the floor for you. You did receive 5 presentations, and I hope it wasn't information overload for you, but I think that's the nature of it. And it was long. We didn't have a tea break. It wasn't structured that way. But so if you want to stretch your feet and come to the front, I'm opening this for you. So here we are. Anybody? Yes. I think so. Yeah, you can.
Thank you very much for all the presentations. They're quite interesting, but also my comment, which is related to the last point that you were guiding us to reach the conclusions, would be how can we access this resource in our different countries? That is the resource people and the organization. We would like a further collaboration. I'm from Lesotho, and I know we don't have sufficient time to tell our stories, what our elected system is, our problems are. But my comment really would be that this should not be the last exchange. How can Africities assist countries that are interested in engaging further with the speakers and their organizations in order to build the capacity of national governments, the capacity of cities, the capacity of all those involved in land management, land allocation and land planning, and in the provision of infrastructure. That is my comment. Thank you.
Right, so you're not limited. You can just come and find and stand up whenever.
A question for Barbara. In the international examples that you were looking at, or the consultation you did in London, was there any, did anyone discuss or anybody bring the issues up around the experience in China? Chinese cities are probably the best examples of land value capture, to some extent taken to an extreme, where the real estate markets, fueled by capturing land values have been inflated and property bubbles have experienced. I mean, this is a trajectory that one can expect if one doesn't have other controls as well on municipalities playing the real estate markets.
Is it quick? The answer is no. Although we are very aware that that was an example that we needed to look at. There's several examples that we wanted to look at. So China was one of them. And then we're going to also engage with a few colleagues working in West Africa. So this is, again, as the lady suggested here, this is a beginning of a conversation, just as I think it is a beginning of a really interesting topic for Ian and Stephen. So yes, the more cases we have, it's something that, as I mentioned earlier on, we are hoping to organize a session in June around there's a conference on African, I can't exactly remember what the name is, and we would be very interested in getting cases like that to come. So I'll contact you too, so that you can give us some good people to discuss these issues.
Thank you so much for sharing some insights with us. I just wanted to say Africa is blessed with land. And we were talking about the poor people, how do they have access to infrastructure. But I believe within the land, the African land, there are resources that are underneath. How are those resources being captured as value? And how can those resources be used to actually raise funding? Here I'm talking about resource-based financing. Thank you. I'm Zinzi from Barclays.
Yes, sir.
Merci. Je suis du Bénin, principalement de la commune d'Abomey-Calavi. Il y a quelque chose que je voudrais ratifier, je ne sais pas si on a tenu compte de la commune d'Akonville. Akonville, ce qui a été écrit, c'est la commune d'Abomey-Calavi et la zone qui est en construction s'appelle Akonville, pas Abomey-Calavi. Eh bien, Abomey-Calavi, c'est une commune qui n'est pas du tout loin de Cotonou. Donc, je ne sais pas si c'est une confusion. Bon, maintenant, je voudrais dire que je ne sais pas si Africities a un organe de suivi, d'exécution des résolutions que nous prenons ici, puisque nous sommes au 7e sommet. Bon, je crois savoir que nous piétinons en Afrique. N'importe comment on vient, on dit les mêmes choses, on revient, et c'est toujours les mêmes choses, alors que nous continuons toujours avec les mêmes pratiques. Normalement, les résolutions de l'Africity, n'est-ce pas, doivent changer nos pratiques dans nos différents pays. Parce que je me rappelle bien, nous allons discuter de ces sujets au Sénégal. Alors, je voudrais vous dire également que, selon l'expérience du Bénin, que effectivement, l'État finance la construction, n'est-ce pas, des infrastructures socio-communautaires, et de même que les mairies aussi le font. Les mairies aussi le font, et sur fonds propres. Et également, l'État subventionne les mairies par le fonds que nous appelons le fonds FADEC. Et ça marche très bien. Mais je voudrais vous informer, je ne sais pas si vous êtes au courant, qu'au Bénin, pour augmenter la valeur des terres, eh bien, qu'est-ce que nous faisons? Nous remettons l'urbanisation, n'est-ce pas, de ces zones dans la main des privés. Et ces privés-là sont composés avec la banque. Et tous les frais de lotissement, eh bien, se reversent à la banque de manière à ce que la banque puisse prendre sa part et que ces opérateurs économiques puissent faire également leur travail comme cela se doit afin de viabiliser, n'est-ce pas, les lieux. Et je peux vous dire qu'aujourd'hui, la commune d'Abomey-Clavier est en pleine construction et en plein lotissement justement. Il y a des difficultés, ça ne marche pas. Il n'y a que 2 zones rurales où on n'a pas encore commencé, n'est-ce pas, l'urbanisation. Et je pense que lorsque nous avons quitté ici, nous sommes en train de prendre les dispositions pour commencer quelque chose. Donc, eh bien, dans ces zones, les terres coûtent moins cher. Très moins cher, puisque ce n'est pas encore loti, eh bien, les projets n'y vont pas. Pourquoi? Parce que la terre continue toujours d'appartenir, n'est-ce pas, aux coutumiers, aux rois, etc. Donc, il y a tout d'abord des décisions. À partir du moment où on fait le lotissement, eh bien, il y a des réserves qui appartiennent désormais n'est-ce pas, à la collectivité, à la commune, à la mairie. Donc, la mairie peut facilement s'approprier de ces réserves-là et faire, n'est-ce pas, de tout cela ce qu'elle veut. Donc, c'est à partir de ce moment où la mairie peut intervenir, la mairie peut vendre des terres, la mairie peut louer des terres aux opérateurs économiques pour pouvoir construire des infrastructures et au grand honneur, n'est-ce pas, du peuple. Je vous remercie beaucoup.
All right, so can I give the speakers a chance to respond, and then we'll take some more if there's more to be asked. Students?
Thanks. I think that most of the points were really observations. I think just to respond to the point from Lesotho, I mean, I think we're very mindful of the fact that there's the need to strengthen capacity building and outreach around this issue. So in fact, the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town is currently at the very early stages of considering a centre for urban law and finance in Africa, which will be a centre to develop and produce courses, short courses on legal and financial instruments for urban expansion and urban development. So we're at very early stages of that, but certainly that is it's a need that we've identified in the centre and which we are pursuing. So hopefully, maybe by the next Africities, we can report back on progress around the centre. Sorry? Yeah, I mean, yeah, so, and the UN Habitat is also developing a course on land-based financing, which should be ready fairly soon, and which I think they are testing in Rwanda, I think. I'm not sure, they certainly, it's, I've been helping them develop that module, but they've got a quite a comprehensive manual on land-based financing. I think that if there was a country government that was interested, the UN Habitat would be very keen to provide that training.
Because we are nearer to you if you're in Cape Town than you're going to Habitat in Nairobi. Can we invite you to come to Lesotho or perhaps send people to
I love coming to Lesotho. Yeah. No, I mean we certainly would be happy to talk to you, yeah. I think the other, I mean, I think the experience of Benin that the gentleman raised really it illustrates the rich diversity that we have on the continent. That we have so many different countries with so many different systems, and it's very difficult in a project like this, obviously, to cover all of those. And certainly to see where there are strong private developer sectors that can certainly assist in urban expansion in terms of providing some of that infrastructure. I think that Zinzi's point also is an important one about the abundance of land. That is something we don't have a constraint with. They're quite different urban growth models that different countries are pursuing. So many countries are trying to contain cities from sprawling and trying to achieve more compact cities. There's an initiative driven by Dr. Shlomo Angel at New York University, which they're testing in Ethiopia, which is looking at a more expansive model for urban growth, where you don't try and contain the city so tightly, but you try to emphasize an efficient provision of infrastructure to provide maximum access, especially for the poor, to infrastructure. So I think that how different countries respond to the land resource is an important question, and it's no surprise that different countries have different approaches to that.
Yes. Anything you want to add?
I wanted to maybe just try and pick up on some of the main points that have been raised, and I think in perhaps leaning forward to things that we can recommend, and admittedly some of these things have come out of the study. I think the first point is the fact that it's an important mechanism, and African countries need to know what it is and know what the potential is, and be starting to implement the systems to have better land-based financing. And I think your point about having it in Lesotho, I think, is probably quite widely held. And so Stephen has indicated some initiatives which can start popularizing it, can start generating standard practice, giving people guidelines, having access to the training, etc. I think DFID is also interested in it, and I think hopefully DFID would also want to take this forward, so that we do have more examples of it happening. I would like to just touch a little bit about the instruments that we've been talking about. So these in-kind contributions, which is basically the developer going to build something. If you work for a city, the developer's building something for you. You have to have the capacity to engage with that developer. So cities or towns, local governments generally, need the capacity to engage with developers. They've got to have strong enough people that can engage with these developers. So that developers don't just do whatever they want to do. And if you actually want to get them to pay according to a certain policy, to make sure that they pay. Secondly, the point was raised earlier today, that money needs to go into infrastructure. So Stephen quoted the example of Harare, for example, where there is the money collected for these property developments supposedly to go to infrastructure, but it doesn't go to infrastructure. So it's the targeting of the money in your accounting system or in your financing system which is so important. And all of this requires organizational capacity in local authorities, so which is something we need to strive for. The other big theme I think has come out is the equitable access to infrastructure. A lot of people say land-based financing or land value capture, it just provides for wealthy people and it divides the city. It doesn't have to be that way. So I thought the big point about that last graph that I showed you on the spectrum of where property developers, you don't want to subsidize property developers who are making a lot of money through commercial developments, high-income housing developments, and even middle-income housing developments. You don't. The first rule, if you like, is don't subsidize them. Subsidize genuinely poor developments to generally poor people. Of course, there's a lot of cities are faced with the argument of developers will be coming to develop in your city. If you don't give us this and this and this, we won't come. But the fact is they are making a lot of money. The fact is the property in most African cities, the property market is either booming or heading towards a boom. I mean, Stephen quoted what was going on in Nairobi. Even Harare has got with all its struggling economy, has got a property development industry it's wanting to take off, and they just don't have the mechanisms or the trust, I think, in the local authority to do these things. So at the very least, don't subsidize those that don't deserve subsidies. If you can, and there are some examples that we were quoted of in particularly in Latin America, those cities are making a lot of money out of these property developments, and those cities can then start using that for slum upgrading, for infrastructure for the poor. That's ultimately the game that you can cross-subsidize. But many African cities are not there yet. I think Latin American cities, and if you take Bogota, are further ahead. They can, or Sao Paulo, they can raise these surplus amounts of money and use that money to fund infrastructure for the poor. So the first step is to recognize where the money is going and where it should go, and set up the mechanisms that you can do land-based financing, starting with simple things like development charges, which can be, if you've got a good policy and a good method of calculating things, every developer knows they're going to pay that money, and everybody knows that money is going to go into that account and it's going to be used for infrastructure. So I think those are probably the main messages we want to take forward, but I mean, other people may want to have some last comments on what they thought.
Je voulais juste faire un commentaire très rapide à l'encontre de notre collègue du Bénin. C'est qu'il est peut-être important aussi de réfléchir à cette capacitation des autorités locales, non seulement dans les villes, mais aussi dans ces régions périurbaines et aussi d'une certaine façon dans les zones rurales, parce qu'il y a énormément d'accaparement des terres qui se passe aussi dans les zones rurales, et qu'il faut aussi une capacité de négociation pour ces autorités locales. Donc c'est un espèce de travail qui peut se faire en se tenant la main, d'une certaine façon. Les autorités locales, urbaines et rurales peuvent travailler justement à savoir comment connaître les mécanismes de ces marchés, j'arrive plus à parler, land markets, enfin bref, on se comprend.
Voilà. Merci.